Paul always suspected King Crab was more of a title than a name. And he wants to be the first human to bend the claw. Because one day, the crustaceans will rise, and only Paul will be spared. Foresight's a wonderful thing. Invest in innovation, including 3D printing, with OPTO.
Welcome to the podcast, Mike. How are things?
Good, thanks, Hayden. Really great to be here. Things are good. Yeah, it's a nice early start to the morning here on the West Coast. A pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks very much for joining us. So just a quick rundown of what we'll cover today for the listeners so they've got an idea of the agenda. So we're going to focus on you initially. We're going to talk about your background, how you came to your position at Veracyte. We'll then talk about the industry at large and any interesting innovations and technological progress within the space there as well. And then we'll get into the detail of some of your products and services that you're putting out as well. As I said, let's start with your background. We should start. I should say we should start with Veracyte. For any listeners that are unfamiliar with the company, perhaps they haven't heard of them, give us a very short explainer of what Veracyte does and how the company makes money.
Yeah, happy to. Pleasure to be here and share that with you. Veracyte is a molecular diagnostics company and a specialty molecular diagnostics company. So what we do is we use this wonderful technology that's really come up in the last decade or so in terms of genomics and sequencing. And, we combine that with AI and machine learning to develop oncology, tests for patients dealing with cancer. So tests in oncology. So we have prostate tests, thyroid tests, lung, breast. Our mission here is to really help provide physicians with the insights that they need when they're treating those patients and to help them make better decisions for those patients, treatment plans and prognosis.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's a really nice explainer. But as I said earlier, we'll dig into the detail of that, some of those products in due course. But let's take a step back. Let's talk about your background and what brought you to Veracyte in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, my background, actually, I started my career many, many years ago in finance. And I was actually brought into the genomics space about, it's over a decade now, a dozen years ago. When I got the opportunity to join this much, much smaller company than it is today, Illumina, who, as I think most of your listeners will know, or viewers will know, is the leading company in genetic sequencing. And so at the time I was at Pfizer in the pharmaceutical industry, and I got this opportunity to come to San Diego to join Illumina, then as the CFO. And I continued my career in finance with them for a while, and then moved into a more operational set of leadership roles. And then that took me to ultimately lead Helix, a population genomics company, which actually was one of the spin-outs from Illumina, actually predated Grail as one of the companies that we set up from within Illumina, working with external investors. And then, I intended to run Helix in its population genomics strategy for a while, but COVID hit, and we actually pivoted the company for the third time to become one of the largest COVID testing labs in the country, which we did very, very successfully. And then after that, I was thinking, okay, what's my next move? And also I had an excellent succession plan in place for Helix, and Veracyte came along and created a great opportunity for me to actually get a little bit closer to the patient now in oncology and cancer diagnostics, which ultimately was what I wanted to do for many personal reasons. And so Veracyte was very attractive to me, and I joined the company in June of 2021, and I've now been here for over 3 years.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it's really interesting. You seem to have a unique kind of perspective on this niche space within the broader market. And I'm interested to learn, as I'm sure some of our listeners will be as well, what lessons you will have learned from those previous roles that inform your approach at Veracyte.
Yeah, I mean, a lot, quite frankly. I have to say those were incredible training grounds. Illumina being a fast growth company in a brand new, highly technological, complex market, creating new markets. And so, as a CFO or the head of population genomics there, or the head of strategy or multiple roles that I had, I couldn't have had a better training ground. And I'd say over the 8 years that I was there, I probably gained decades of actual real experience in such a fast, high growth environment. Of course, I also learned the science, which as a finance person was really always very important to me. The better you understand the business, the better you know the technology, the better you can be in whatever role, especially in finance. And I'm passionate about the technology too. which makes it a lot easier to learn. So that really, gave me the foundation that I need in to be running a genomics-based company like Veracyte. And then Helix, I really don't know what to say about the COVID experience. There, in the space of about a year, I probably gained another decade of experience running a company in a very challenging environment where we were dealing with supply chain issues and state-related issues, all sorts of things over the course of that year as we scaled that testing facility, including building a brand new facility from scratch in the space of about 3 months to be able to do over 100,000 tests per day. So it was quite an interesting and character building experience for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with that in mind, then let's use this as a juncture to talk about the wider industry. To give you listeners a sense of kind of what's going on there, the key tailwinds, the key headwinds that you're experiencing in your market. And I was reading around the subject, and a few articles referenced the molecular diagnostics industry had felt. They described it as a slump in recent years. You can tell me kind of how fair an assessment that is. But some headwinds that were referenced were the competing diagnostic techniques and the competition in that space. A lack of regulatory clarity was also referenced as well. But just give me a sense of, first, how fair that assessment is and what the critical factors at play are.
I think it's fair in some respects, but a little unfair in some others. If I think about the broader industry, and I'm talking really specialty diagnostics and molecular diagnostics in a more complex environment. So, for example, companies that are using new technologies like genetic testing to come up with these really novel, breakthrough, complex tests for solving new challenges that haven't been addressed before. Now, that industry, I mean, if you think about it, it's fairly nascent. It's in its first couple of innings in terms of maturity. It's been, spawned out of these technologies that came out from companies like Illumina just a decade or so ago, and really, at scale. And, the way that I'd say the industry has evolved, that has come back to really hurt us in the last couple of years, is there used to be a period where, from an investment standpoint, high growth at whatever cost was very much rewarded. So, coming up with new tests, launching those new tests, even if you weren't able to get reimbursement for those tests or generate a good average selling price and ASP, but as long as you were able to talk about large markets and large future growth, the fact that these companies were burning a lot of cash really didn't seem to faze anybody, and these companies just got rewarded for that. And so many of them came about in that environment. Then COVID hit, and of course the industry was a very attractive industry from an inward investment standpoint at that time, from a capital markets standpoint. I think we all saw what happened then in 2020, early 21, in terms of how this market got to what was probably at that time a local maximum.
Yeah.
And so that really continued. And then I'd say the environment changed. And I think we were actually, we can talk about Veracyte, but we were a little bit ahead of predicting how that might happen. But the way the environment changed was that high growth at any cost was no longer rewarded. A lot of companies have gone public, many through this SPAC process. And I would venture to say too early, without the kind of foundational underpinnings to be able to support that for the long term. And burning cash was no longer rewarded because the capital markets became a little bit closed, very closed to these types of industries. And so the ability to get to cash flow break even and cash flow positive generation became a new requirement. And so a lot of these companies started to struggle. They struggled to raise cash. They struggled to pay for the debt that they were carrying on their balance sheets. They struggled to turn profitable. They struggled to get reimbursement. And some of them failed. And so the way I think about it now is there's a neighborhood we're all living in. It's the molecular diagnostics neighborhood. And the neighborhood's pretty unattractive. It has been pretty unattractive. There are houses with boarded up windows. There are houses on fire. There's houses that have completely collapsed and fallen down. And then there's a couple of nice houses in that neighborhood. But the problem is you don't even drive down the neighborhood to take a look at the nice houses that are down there. And I think that's how I kind of think about, us. We're one of those nice houses in a tough neighborhood. But what I will say is I think certainly in the last couple of quarters, as an industry, we're really starting to turn that corner. I think you saw that in Q2 with a lot of companies, including Veracyte, having a pretty decent quarter. In our case, a very.
Yeah. I want to get into Q2 earnings in just a second. But before we do, I mean, you talked about kind of how maybe Veracyte are one of few or one of a handful of companies that have space. Let's dig into exactly how you're doing that and how you differentiate your products and services. So again, reading around the subject, other companies seem to focus on the beginning of the cancer care continuum, i.e. screening, or you've got the other end where they're determining if cancer has come back. Why did Veracyte decide to focus on the middle of that overall spectrum or continuum, i.e., at around the time of diagnosis?
Yeah, we're actually today the majority of our testing is in that middle space. There's no question about that. But we made some very important strategic decisions. One is we will address the entire care continuum with our technology for patients with cancer or patients who are suspected of having cancer. So there's some symptomatic or potential high risk concern there, all the way through to patients who've been treated with cancer. That's our goal. That means we're not interested in healthy screening. So we're not in this multi-cancer early detection world. We'll let others work on that. I have some views on that. I'm happy to share them. But we are dealing with patients from the beginning that they're either suspected of having cancer or confirmed with having cancer all the way to the end. Now, the majority of our tests are currently in the middle. That is prognosis and prediction, and a little bit in terms of diagnosis. But ultimately, what our tests are doing is determining the treatment path today. We actually did recently acquire a company that helps us to go a little bit further downstream. We were always concerned that we can help with the patient's diagnosis, prognosis, prediction of the appropriate treatments, and then, having that treatment. And then we would lose the patient after that. Well, with our acquisition of an MRD technology, we now have the opportunity to follow up the patient after they've been treated, whether it be by therapy or surgeries. So no, I'd say actually we are in the middle today, but we absolutely have a strategy and plans to broaden, as I say, across the care continuum for those patients with cancer or high risk.
Yeah, fantastic. Really interesting insight. Is that acquisition C2I Genomics?
Yes.
Yes, right. Yeah, I was going to ask you kind of how that acquisition supports the long-term business strategy and even the current one, but I think you've answered that. But if I come back to how Veracyte differentiate and digging in, I think, to your products and services, the Veracyte Diagnostics platform is a really interesting product, and I think one that's obviously key to your offering and one that our listeners will be keen to get a further understanding of. So perhaps just walk us through exactly how that works.
Yeah, if we think about the that platform and how it differentiates us, I think it is actually an excellent point that you raised. Maybe I should start with talking a little bit about the technology here and how it works. The way that our tests work is we start with a sample, and oftentimes it's a tissue sample. So normally a patient's being treated. A biopsy is a normal standard of care. It might be a fine needle aspirate for a thyroid. It might be a biopsy or radical prostatectomy tissue from a prostate cancer patient. It could be a tissue from a lung cancer patient or a breast tissue, whatever. And then what we're doing with our tests is we're looking for changes in expression or the particular types of expression signatures, genetic expression, so RNA-based signatures. But we'll talk about DNA. We actually cover that with MRD, but today RNA-based signatures. And we've developed these very complex algorithms that are able to identify those signatures. If you think about it, assign a risk category or a diagnosis based on those signatures and exactly, per patient. This is real precision medicine on a per patient basis, how those signatures might actually show up in every individual particular patient. So that's the technology. Now, we made a very important decision very early on in our company's beginning that more data was better. So we've always run a whole transcriptome, which means we're looking at the RNA expression across, more than 20,000 genes in every patient. And then we develop our test based on that broad set of data. And that does a couple of things. Firstly, it helps us come up with a better test in the first place. And then secondly, it helps us to fuel research and drive more evidence development. And so the way the Veracyte Diagnostics platform works is more data leads to more insights, which leads to more evidence, which leads to more adoption. And then that adoption, that real world adoption, where every patient, we run a whole transcriptome again, leads to fueling more research, which fuels more insights and so on, and the flywheel keeps turning. And so that's very unique to Veracyte. And we've been consistent about that in every one of our tests. including our recent MRD acquisition, which is using a blood sample in particular, liquid biopsy. And so that we believe very strongly in. I think that's a point of debate that others have right now, whether that MRD market becomes whole genome. We actually think it will. Mm-hmm. But the reason for that is because we believe in that model of more data.
Yeah, fantastic. And I imagine central or fundamental to that belief is your use of AI. I mean, I guess it wouldn't be possible to put data at the center of your overall strategy if AI wasn't there. So talk to us about how Veracyte are using AI in your business.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the machine learning part of AI, and we'll talk about the more recent evolution of AI technology and how that might play in. But if you think about the early utilization of machine learning in developing these classifiers and these genomic algorithms and these biomarker-based tests, we've been doing that for years. Right? So we have a lot of skills and capabilities and proprietary knowledge within our company to be able to take these techniques and apply them to the vast amounts of data that we generate when we come up with our tests and then when we run our tests. Now, obviously a couple of years ago, we, like everybody else, were looking at how the tools and the capabilities and the compute power around AI is evolving and how that might lead to even greater and completely revolutionary new ways of doing the science that we do. And so we've invested very heavily for a company like us in AI capabilities, including we actually, one fell swoop, acquired a lot of such capabilities when we acquired C2I. And so now we have dozens of people in the company with those advanced capabilities. And we think about how we can apply AI to make our tests better in the future, to come up with new tests, to improve the entire patient and physician experience and workflow. And then ultimately as well, very internally facing, how we can make our own operations more effective and more efficient. There are many ways. I don't think, a lot of us understand how this new generative AI and other capabilities that are coming up can be applied in companies like ours. We just know there will be many ways. And I think over the next multiple years, five or so years, we're going to be figuring that out. And we'll be ready to deploy that technology in completely new and revolutionary ways to make every part of our patient testing process better.
Yeah, fascinating. I think, analyzing the data and large amounts of data is one thing, but thinking of the things that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of is where it gets really interesting. And that's something I've spoken to other biotech companies on the podcast about as well. I just want to jump back to liquid biopsies. Obviously, that's something you've mentioned a couple of times now.
Mm.
Talk to us about, firstly, why they're so important, why they're so interesting, and how you think these multi-cancer early detection tests will actually impact the wider industry at large.
Yeah, I think let's start with the multi-cancer early detection part, the second part of your question. I think it's a really interesting use of the technologies. Maybe listeners understand this already, but I'm happy to explain it a little bit. But the theory there, and in fact, it's more than a theory, it's actually been demonstrated, that when you're dealing with cancer, that tumor is shedding and showing up in the bloodstream as these circulating fragments of DNA. And with the really sensitive technology that we have available to us, you can actually see that signal, that very, very tiny signal, in a lot of noise. You can imagine in a simple sample of blood, there's a lot going on, there's a lot of noise in there, and you're looking for a very small percentage of the DNA that you actually find is related to the tumor that you might be dealing with. And so then that scientific breakthrough leads to an application called multi-cancer early detection. The idea being that if you can identify those signals, and you can identify cancer in its very early stages of development, at which point, of course, the signal is even harder to detect than in late stages of development. But early stage is really when you want to catch it. So the technology is great, and I love the idea. My skepticism around it is to screen multiple individuals, ostensibly healthy individuals, every year. It leads to two things. One, the significant costs that somebody's got to pay for. And I think the rate at which that gets paid for is going to be a question. If you think about screening programs today, they're typically not as expensive as this might be. Like, for example, in lung cancer screening, a simple, fairly non-invasive and low-cost, low-dose CT, or in prostate cancer screening, a PSA, which I know has its pros and its cons. So for a complex test like this to become the standard of care, I think it requires a lot of soul-searching around how it's going to get priced. The second thing it could lead to is the false positives. And false positives are a challenge. If you tune that signal too much and you're finding potential cancer when cancer isn't there, you're putting the patient and the system through a lot. And so these tests have to be very finely tuned to be effective at early stage detection. Now, so that's the multi-cancer early detection part of liquid biopsy. Having said that, liquid biopsy has an incredible opportunity that is already starting to play out in helping patients who have been treated for cancer. And it's, again, the exact same theory, right? You're looking for that signal in the blood. Here, what happens is the patient's been treated. In most cases, you do have tissue. And if you don't, then liquid biopsy can really provide an opportunity that you wouldn't otherwise have. But in most cases, you have tissue. You know from the tissue what signature you're looking for. So you can much more effectively tune that algorithm to search for that exact signature after the patient's been treated. So when the patient's having therapy, you can see how effective that particular therapy is based on what's happening with the fragments of circulating tumor DNA. And you can also tell after surgery whether there's any residual disease. And so that's really where I get excited about this liquid biopsy technology. That's why we bought C2I, and that's why we're focused on MRD. And the great thing about it is, again, it's multi-cancer, right? It's a platform. And it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with breast cancer or lung cancer, for example, or in many cases colon cancer, which a lot of people are doing. You know, it doesn't matter. It's the same technology that's applied. You're just looking for a different type of signature. Now, some cancers don't shed as well as others. And so there might be limitations to the technology there, but it's certainly in most tissue-based cancers, it's already proving to be detected.
Yeah, really interesting. So that's obviously a technology, as you say, you have high conviction in, that is evidenced by your acquisition of C2I. But give us a sense of how you go about weighing up the pros and cons of a new technology, and then how you translate that into a product or service. How does that decision-making process work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and a really pertinent one. It starts with the strategy, right? Of course, which is, our strategy to be helping patients with cancer or suspected of cancer. Clearly, patients who've been treated with, for cancer would be within our strategy, and we would want to be able to help them. And our current testing platform was not able to do that in the way that we saw the market evolving. And so this new application clearly exists. We've been saying for some time we want to have an MRD capability.
Mark, you've mentioned MRD a couple of times now. Perhaps you can just give us an insight into exactly what that is and how it works.
Yeah, so MRD, our definition is minimal residual disease. And the way that it works is it's, as I described earlier about the liquid biopsy being used for multi-cancer early detection, it's that same technology in theory and science being used for patients who have cancer and who have been treated with cancer. And so what you're doing there, again, you're looking in a liquid biopsy, so a blood sample, you're looking for that signature of circulating tumor DNA. That signature, you know what you're looking for in this case, because most of the time you actually have tissue. So you can sequence the tissue sample, which gives you the signature to look for. And then when you sequence the blood, you know exactly what signature you're trying to detect, and then you can detect it a lot more sensitively. And so it's used for, as I said, for patients who've either had therapy, you're trying to figure out if the therapy is working. So you can look in the blood sample for fragments of DNA that tell you whether the particular therapy is having the effect that you wanted it to or expected it to. And then you can also use it for patients who've had surgery, had the tumor removed, and you're looking for residual tumor, which tells you whether or not you got it all or it's returning in some way or showing up somewhere else in the body.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that helps to give us the necessary context to now move on to discuss your financial results. You mentioned Q2 earnings just a moment ago. It was a great second quarter for Veracyte. I think I saw you increase revenue by around 27% year over year. Walk us through the key results from that Q2 announcement and just give us a sense of Veracyte's overall financial.
Yeah, and I think I'd really want people to think about Veracyte not just in the context of Q2, although Q2 was an excellent quarter, but in the context of probably the last 3 years. If you think about the last 3 years, Veracyte changed 3 years ago to become a very different company with the acquisition of 2 other companies. So we became multinational, broad portfolio of products, employees in multiple time zones. We went from around 250 employees to around 850 employees. And at that point, we started on this philosophy of the really focusing on the financial performance and long-term sustainability of the business, because we saw where that puck was going. To my comments earlier about the neighborhood, we saw what was happening in the neighborhood, and we've always had this philosophy here at Veracyte, that we need to differentiate ourselves. And so for the last 12 or 13 quarters, we've consistently beaten our own expectations and raised our expectations. And Q2 of 2024 was really the most recent culmination of that. The quarter was fantastic. It was driven by our core testing business, so our Afirma test for thyroid cancer and our Decipher test for prostate cancer. Both grew significantly. Decipher volumes grew 32%, Afirma volumes grew 17% in the quarter. And so our total testing grew 31%, which in this current environment is an incredible growth rate. But as I mentioned earlier, where growth used to be rewarded, you need to be able to deliver a lot more than that. Today, you need to be able to deliver profitability, and not just any meaningful profitability. And so what I was really proud of in the second quarter is we took our adjusted earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization, or adjusted EBITDA number, to 21%, which means our margin is in the quarter was 21%. That grew from 15% on a consistent basis in the prior quarter, and we guided that we're going to continue to be meaningfully profitable. I've said publicly that I think a well-run specialty diagnostics company like ours should be able to deliver 25% adjusted EBITDA on an ongoing basis. And that means philosophically, when you launch new tests, you have to have a clear path to reimbursement. You have to get paid, the whole idea of you have to get paid for doing these complex tests and helping patients and physicians in the way that you do. And then, you have to do very, I'd say, focused R&D on new products, right? I mean, you can't just work on, and it's not just about the financials, it's about management and, people's own individual focus and objectives. You got to be focused on a few really important things rather than, a dozen shots on goal. And so one of the things that we've done over time is we've really got our portfolio focused on these really important projects. So there's really 5 things that I have the whole company focused on today. Continued growth of Decipher and Afirma, which, as you can see, is happening really well. Our expansion outside of the US into European and other markets with our tests, really important because there are patients there who need those tests. Launch of a really, our MRD capabilities we talked about, and also launch of a really interesting breakthrough technology, a non-invasive test for lung cancer called Percepta nasal swab, which we're working on. So those are the 5 things that I have the whole company's objectives and goals aligned around. And then there's a lot of things that we've decided not to invest in order to, A, keep the focus, and B, improve the financial performance.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to pick up on a couple of those strategic kind of points that you mentioned. One of the 5 was your expansion geographically. What are some of the unique challenges for diagnostics companies in offering their tests outside of the US, and how are Veracyte combating those?
I think there's a lot of reasons. It can be, firstly, the US model of having a clear laboratory and being able to run your tests in one location for the entire nation is very optimized and efficient. You can't do that. You can't set up one of those labs in every important country. The incidence rate just isn't there to make that financially viable. These are very complex labs. I mean, we talk a lot about FDA regulation of tests like this. We're already held to a very high standard in these laboratories, and so it's quite an extensive investment, capital and human capital, to put one of these labs in place. And so what we've come to the conclusion that we can actually and should launch our tests as kits, that we can enable other labs that already exist and already do a lot of testing in their own countries and understand how to do that and have the relationships with the physicians and the hospitals, or in some cases embedded in the hospitals, enabling them to be able to run Decipher prostate, or our Prosigna breast cancer test, or ultimately our nasal swab test for lung cancer. And so that is the model that we've adopted. Many worry about sharing margin with the lab itself. The lab has to be able to obviously cover its costs and in some cases generate a profit if they're commercial. And then we also have to cover our costs of the kit and also generate a meaningful and appropriate level of profit there. And we believe we can do that with a multi-platform strategy, we'll be launching our tests on PCR or NGS, and we already have them on the nCounter platform. And enable going country by country, enabling those labs to run those tests, and we believe that we can make that work. Whereas I think others just generally shy away from doing that, or they stay just very focused on the US first. The US is great, but if I think about, for example, prostate cancer, we've got a third of men in the US with prostate cancer who are being tested with a molecular diagnostic, and most of them are used with Decipher. There are even more incidences of prostate cancer in Europe, and these tests just aren't generally and widely available. And so, there's an important part of our mission here is to make those tests available to patients with prostate cancer. I've dealt with prostate cancer in my family in the UK, and today, if I was dealing with that in the UK, I'd be pretty upset if my family member couldn't get access to a test like Decipher.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's exciting to hear. You mentioned, and I hadn't planned to ask about it, but you've piqued my interest with that nasal swab test for the lung cancer. Perhaps you can just give us an explanation of that and how it's innovative and different from what's...
Yeah, it's really innovative, in fact, because it's based on this. Firstly, I think we all understand and appreciate at this point in our lifetimes that smoking causes, can be a significant contributor to cancer. And the way that it contributes is it changes the genetic expression, and you can pick up those changes in expression. And that was identified many years ago. But what the breakthrough is that we are really applying here is that those changes in expression don't just occur at the site where the lung nodule happens to exist. And a lung nodule is kind of your first indicator that something untoward is going on here. But those changes in expression show up all the way in the airway, in the epithelial cells of the airway. And so with a simple nasal swab, we're able to take some of those cells, sequence them in our lab. And with this very complex AI-based or machine learning-based algorithm, I should say, that we developed many years ago, we are able to classify a patient as being low, intermediate, or high risk for lung cancer. And that's important because so many patients with a lung nodule today don't have a high risk of lung cancer. They are benign, but they might be going through an invasive procedure like a biopsy, a bronchoscopy. And so many patients that do have a high risk of lung cancer might just be put on a surveillance program. They may come back, they may not come back. That cancer could very quickly develop into stage 4. And we all know lung cancer is one of the leading causes of death. It is a leading cause of death. And so it's really important not to let that happen. So our innovative test, enables the physician to be able to make that assessment, add that into their toolbox without having to go and get tissue just by doing a very simple nasal swab in this way.
Yeah, fantastic. A really exciting innovation. I'm glad we were able to touch on that. A couple more questions from me then. You, last week, I think, announced the addition of Brent Schaefer and Tom Miller to your board of directors. Perhaps you can give us an insight into what they're likely to add to the business and what experience and skill sets they're likely to bring.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Our board is really important, as it should be in any public company like ours, but not just, for governance, but for helping us with strategy and driving the business in the right direction. We really rely on our board to challenge our thinking, to come up with fresh and new ideas, and to leverage their experience to do so. And so as we were out looking for new board members to replace some board members that we have lost over the last few years, we decided, number one, we wanted an experienced CEO who sat in this seat that I'm in and kind of understands, how to drive businesses, high growth businesses like this. And so we found Brent with his experience at Cerner. He brings a lot of capabilities that we really could value on our board, including having, been in this space, having been in this seat, and also dealt with, healthcare IT in a very meaningful way, which is really important. And so, Brent brings that, and Tom is running one of these, very innovative and progressive pharmaceutical companies that's leveraging AI in novel and new ways. And with his academic experience and also business experience, he brings to us that, really important AI capability and strategic thinking. That as we evolve, as I said to you earlier, how we think about AI, how it can be deployed in our company for our patients, for our physicians, for ourselves, he can actually help us think through that and challenge our thinking. One of the things we all have to remember is, there's a lot of interest and excitement about AI, but you also have to think about the limitations, right? If you get a little bit ahead of your skis on these things, then they can actually be counterproductive. So he can help us in that regard too. And then ultimately, with any new board member, we're looking for a really good cultural fit. And we found that in both Brent and Tom. So I couldn't be more excited to have them join our company.
Yeah, fantastic. Really exciting additions by the sounds of it. And I think that's a nice juncture actually to lead into my final question. We often speak to, and our goal is to speak to, the most innovative public companies around the world. One of the many reasons we were interested to speak to Veracyte. So we always finish by asking the guest for their next big idea, the most exciting technology innovation that they're looking out for over the next few years. So if I could ask you for that and how Veracyte are working to harness that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but for us, it absolutely is the AI and the new generative AI capabilities and compute capabilities. We will always be focused on genomics. We know with our data-first strategy and our data matters strategy that we're going to be generating, as our company grows, even more data. And it's how do you best use that data to come up with entire new products, to make existing products better, to improve the workflow, to improve the operations of the company. And how do you do that in a very structured and effective way? It's not just, a case of saying, hey, there's these new capabilities and I can go leverage them now. You have to have the infrastructure to do that. And so 2 years ago, we started building that infrastructure. We started focusing on our cloud strategy and how you use different services. And we've invested a lot into that already. And that was important because that now enables us to go harness these technologies. And I think, if you think about healthcare, to me, healthcare is ripe for a new revolutionary technology like this to be applied in ways, as I said earlier, we can't even imagine how today. And so, to be a company right in the middle of the very important, complex, oncology diagnostics space and not be able to use that technology and lead in using that technology, I think that would be a travesty. So that's what I'm most excited about in terms of innovative new technology. Having said that, we'll continue to be, using genomics too, which is still, as I said earlier, a very nascent technology. The power comes in combining those two alongside Veracyte's diagnostics platform of more data is better. And as I think about that, I can imagine incredible ways that Veracyte's going to be able to leverage both those, the data and those two really important technologies and put them together in the future in ways people aren't even thinking about.
Yeah, fantastic. That intersection of AI and healthcare is a theme that's cropped up on this podcast a number of times and pretty much one of the most compelling secular trends out there. So really excited we're able to highlight that point. I think that just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining me on the podcast, Marc. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Aidan. Appreciate it. It's been a pleasure for me too.